Your Excellency Paul Kagame, President of Rwanda and Chairperson of the African Union, Your Excellency Moussa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. Allow me to begin on a personal note linked to the theme of this year's meeting. In the search for durable solutions to forced displacement, the world, and indeed I personally, have drawn constant inspiration from African leadership, African vision, and African compassion. Despite the continent's own social, economic, and security challenges, Africa's governments and people have kept borders, doors, and hearts open to millions in need. And unfortunately, this example has not been followed everywhere. Unfortunately, generosity is not proportional to wealth. Africa has set the gold standard for solidarity. The 1969 OAU Refugee Convention goes beyond the landmark 51 Refugee Convention. The Kampala Convention on Internally Displaced Persons is the first and only regional convention of this kind. And African leadership was vital to secure the adoption of two pivotal global compacts on refugees and on safe, orderly, and regular migration last year. But these conventions were already coming to life in every corner of the continent through the spirit of African compassion. I will never forget seeing Liberian farmers share their seed rice for the next planting season to feed desperate newcomers fleeing civil unrest in Côte d'Ivoire. I will always remember the electric air of joy as I stood with Congolese returning from Tanzania, joined the repatriation convoy to South Sudan, or rode on a truck carrying Liberians home from Sierra Leone. And my heart still breaks as I recall people such as Muslima, a Somali woman refugee I met in Doloado, Ethiopia. She had walked 2 weeks and lost 3 of her 6 children along the way before finally finding desperate needed safety and care. Over many years, it has become clear to me Africa's generosity to those seeking havens from war and persecution is unmatched. As High Commissioner for Refugees, I greatly admired and depended on that solidarity. And from day one, as Secretary General of the UN, I have been determined to forge ever close ties between the United Nations and Africa. And indeed, there has been a quantum leap in our strategic cooperation with the African Union. We have signed joint frameworks on peace and security and on sustainable development. We have institutionalized the UN-AU annual conferences at the summit level. We have conducted numerous joint high-level visits across the continent. And Chairperson Faki and I recently signed a joint declaration on cooperation for peace support operations. The AU Commission and the UN Secretariat had our first human rights dialogue, an encouraging step on a critical issue. Excellencies, I would like to highlight 3 common challenges: peace and security, sustainable development, and climate change. On peace and security, strong winds of hope are blowing across the African continent. The African Union's efforts to silence the guns by 2020 are gaining ground, and the UN surge in diplomacy for peace is producing results, and the fruits of our strategic partnership are indeed making a difference. Ethiopia and Eritrea have shown the way, and I pay tribute to the extraordinary courage, wisdom, and leadership of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. In the Central African Republic, the signing of a peace agreement this week, mediated by the African Union with the support of the UN, is an important step on the long path to ending bloodshed. In South Sudan, the agreement facilitated by IGAD between the parties to the conflict has revitalized chances for peace. And in Libya, the ceasefire in and around Tripoli, brokered by the United Nations, is still holding, despite all difficulties. Our efforts have helped stabilize the currency, brought some measure of economic relief, and enabled a realistic prospect for security reform. Now it's time to help unite the Libyan people to advance the political process through a national conference, paving the way for reconciliation and future elections. All this remarkable progress in conflict resolution in Africa shows the determination of the African Union and the United Nations. And a similar story is unfolding with respect to prevention. I welcome the first peaceful transition of power in the Democratic Republic of the Congo since independence in 1960. In Mali, presidential elections were successfully organized in line with Mali's constitutional and legal frameworks. And in Madagascar, the peaceful presidential elections are testament to the responsibility of national stakeholders and to our close cooperation. Excellencies, it is in this context of renewed hope that we increase our mutual support to peace operations in Africa. To consolidate and build on our gains, I have launched the Action for Peacekeeping initiative to enable UN missions to be more effective, better equipped, safer, and more robust. And I thank African member states and the African Union Commission for endorsing these efforts. African countries provide nearly half of all blue helmets deployed worldwide, including some 2/3 of all women peacekeepers and the majority of the United Nations police. Their service and sacrifice are always at the forefront of our minds. Just yesterday, 3 Ethiopian peacekeepers serving the United Nations mission in Addis were killed when their helicopter crashed. I want to extend my deep solidarity and condolences to their families, as well as to the government and people of Ethiopia, wishing a speedy recovery to all those injured. But our peacekeeping operations are increasingly being called into areas where indeed there is no peace to keep. And that is why I've been repeatedly expressing my support for African peace enforcing and counter-terrorism operations. And I salute the sacrifices of the African soldiers in AMISOM, the G5 Joint Force, and the multinational Joint Task Force in the Lake Chad region. But to be fully effective, those African peace operations require robust mandates from the Security Council and predictable, sustainable financing, including assessed contributions. And you can count on my full support fighting for that purpose. And I also welcome our joint advocacy for women's leadership in peace processes and political agreements. Groups such as FemWise and the African Women Leaders Network are making invaluable contributions, and women's equality, meaningful participation and leadership are critical to lasting peace. Excellences, nous savons tous qu'il ne saurait y avoir de paix durable sans développement durable. L'ONU est fermement déterminée à soutenir l'agenda 2053 de l'Union africaine et le programme 2030 de l'organisation. Mais la communauté mondiale est à la traîne pour ce qui est de résoudre 2 problèmes majeurs: atteindre les objectifs de développement durable et lutter contre les changements climatiques.
The world is not doing enough, neither is it acting fast.
Des objectifs de développement durable une réalité. Au rythme actuel, nous n'accomplirons que la moitié du travail et le financement est essentiel. Les pays développés doivent s'acquitter des obligations découlant du programme d'action d'Addis Ababa. Et je félicite l'action menée par les pays africains pour mobiliser des ressources nationales, notamment grâce à des réformes fiscales, à la lutte contre la corruption et à d'autres mesures de bonne gouvernance. Mais dans le même temps, la communauté internationale doit agir de manière bien plus efficace pour combattre les flux illicites de capitaux, le blanchissement de l'argent et l'évasion fiscale qui continuent de drainer des ressources vitales du continent africain, allant la plupart d'ailleurs vers le monde développé. Excellencies, we have another mighty challenge before us. Climate change is still moving much faster than our efforts to slow it. Just this past week, the World Meteorological Organization confirmed that the last 4 years have been the hottest since records began, emphasizing the urgency of accelerated climate action. Climate change is an existential threat, and particularly here in Africa, which has least responsibility for the crisis, but will shoulder some of the heaviest burden. Global emissions continue to rise, and the essential target of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is becoming ever more elusive. We need more ambition on mitigation, on adaptation, on finance, and on innovation. And I will convene a climate summit in New York in September to spur action by political leaders, the business community, and civil society. And this includes mobilizing the $100 billion a year for climate action that were pledged by the developed world. Excelências, permitam-me que termine com 2 palavras na minha própria língua, em português. Grandes desafios persistem, mas há ventos de esperança a soprar por toda a nossa agenda comum. A África está a avançar e há razões reais para o otimismo. As Nações Unidas continuarão a trabalhar convosco em prol de um futuro pacífico e próspero para todos os africanos. Muito obrigado.